They bled us white, the bastards. They've taken everything we had. And not just from us, from our fathers, and from our fathers' fathers.
And from our fathers' fathers' fathers.
Yeah.
And from our fathers' 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 fathers.
All right, Stan, don't labour the point. And what have they ever given us in return?
The aqueduct?
What?
The aqueduct.
Oh, yeah, they did give us that. That's true, yeah.
And the sanitation.
Oh, yeah, the sanitation, Reg. Remember what the city used to be like?
Yeah, all right, I'll grant you, the aqueduct and sanitation are two things the Romans have done.
And the roads.
Well, yeah, obviously the roads. I mean, the roads go without saying, don't they? But apart from the sanitation, the aqueduct and the roads...
Irrigation. Medicine. Education.
Yeah, all right, fair enough.
And the wine.
Yeah, that's something we'd really miss, Reg, if the Romans left.
Public baths.
And it's safe to walk in the streets at night now, Reg.
Yeah, they certainly know how to keep order. Let's face it, the only ones who could in a place like this.
All right, but apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, a fresh water system and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us?
Brought peace.
Oh, peace! Shut up!
Hello and welcome back to Well That Aged Well, and this week we have another returning guest in with Bryan Ward-Perkins. And the last time we discussed the rise and fall of the the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and but this week we're going to discuss a very famous line from a very famous movie called Life of Brian. And decided to do the whole episode about this because it's kind of a good question actually. When Reg asked this group, I think it's the Judean People's Front, or I don't think it's the People's Front of Judea. I know how where he asked the famous question. So, apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, the fresh water system, and public health, and well, peace, what have the Romans ever done for us, Brian?
Okay, well, I mean, it is a good line. It's a very, very fine line in the Life of Brian. As anybody who's read anything I've written, I think the Romans did achieve quite a lot of those things. I mean, it was achieved by brutal conquest initially, suppressing all kinds of people who absolutely did not wish to be conquered, including people who were prepared to sort of starve themselves under siege, for instance, in Spain, before surrendering to the Romans. But
the sack of Carthage, for example.
Oh yes, no. It's the I mean, Roman imperialism is not a nice thing, but I mean, it did actually achieve some things which are quite remarkable. A completely peaceful Mediterranean with absolutely no piracy. Periodic civil wars, unquestionably, but substantially a peaceful empire in which, for instance, the majority of the population not only didn't bear arms, were actually banned from bearing arms. And so, I mean,
Take that Second Amendment.
Sorry?
Take that Second Amendment.
Yes, exactly. No, I mean, so, and in fact, I mean, one of the things that Monthy Python doesn't mention, a single currency. I mean, the euro before the euro. I mean, admittedly, in Britain and you're in Norway, aren't you? I mean, haven't joined the single currency, but
I mean, we are part of the EEA, which kind of is part of the EU, but it's not really.
Yeah. So, I mean, unquestionably, there were good things. I mean, one of the things that I find most interesting is that all modern empires have fallen apart because people wanted to get out of them. That's true of the British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Soviet Empire, you name it. I mean, what's taken them apart is people wanting to get out and leading resistance movements and eventually achieving their freedom. I mean, one of the striking things about the Roman Empire is that isn't the case. There are some people who were never satisfied, in particular the Jews, but also there is some evidence that the 5th century Britons had a wish to get out. But in general, in terms of causes of the fall of the Roman Empire, the wish for freedom just doesn't feature on that list.
I mean, to be fair, nationalism wasn't even a thing back then. It may have been different had nationalism been a thing back in ancient Rome, but
that's
I think
absolutely
that was
true.
the decisive factor.
No, that is absolutely true, and it is true that obviously what we're talking about is a tiny percentage of the elite who needed to identify with the empire, because obviously most people had no political rights whatsoever, and they were probably deeply oppressed, but actually sort of socially oppressed rather than sort of nationalistically oppressed. But it is still striking that people identified with Rome. I mean, if you went to Roman Britain has these extraordinary mosaics with scenes of Dido and Aeneas, and there's a recent one just discovered with scenes from the Trojan War, and these are people whose ancestors presumably were Celts who have learnt Latin, identified with Roman culture. And Roman culture was flexible. It was much more flexible than many modern cultures when it came to imperialism, because, for instance, it was happy to embrace gods from other religions. So if you were in Bath in Roman Britain, you go, I mean, the healing springs there were the healing springs of Sul Minerva. Sul was a Celtic goddess, and she's associated with Minerva, a Latin goddess. So Roman Empire was quite flexible in terms of identity, and it did, achieve this remarkable period of peace, and crucially, which the life of Bryan doesn't, for instance, deal with, actually considerable economic development. The rise of mass production, which we know about most from things like pottery because it survives so well, but which certainly applied to all sorts of other goods as well.
Now, I think it's fair to say, and by the beginning, it was such a brutal conquest, and people didn't really want to be part of the Romans at the first. So, but a lot of people seem today, especially on the internet, and we have these memes of last year with how much do you think about the Roman Empire? People today seem to worship the Roman Empire more or less, and people have always done since the Renaissance pretty much. But we shouldn't really worship the Romans, should we? So why do you think is this worship factor of the Romans when in reality we really shouldn't look at them as the heroes we think they are?
It's a good question. When you say people do worship them, it depends. It tends to be something of a right-wing position, and I've been accused of being a closet right-wing extremist because I said the Roman Empire wasn't absolutely all bad. It did actually achieve certain things for quite a lot of people. In terms of modern academic thinking, Roman Empire is deeply out of fashion because imperialism is so out of fashion. I mean, I personally think imperialism rightly out of fashion in terms of the modern world, because, as you say, I mean, nationalism was around. People do not wish to be oppressed by other people, and there was definitely, I mean, in terms of a sort of negative side to the legacy of Rome, I mean, the fact that it was the most successful imperialist enterprise and was therefore picked up by everybody, as something to emulate. I mean, that's a terrible legacy for the future, because it was so successful. The idea that people could emulate that and achieve the same thing again.
Now, I want to begin with the list that Reg says of all the things that the Romans actually did give us. We're going to discuss more negative aspects of this later on. But I want to begin with sanitation first. So how did Roman sanitation actually work, and how did this kind of affect daily life in the Roman world?
Well, it's mainly affecting cities because Romans built aqueducts, bringing in fresh water. And they did this not just in the great cities. I mean, Rome, of course, had an extraordinary plethora of aqueducts bringing in water, I think, from 7 different sources. And in Rome, they even were able to differentiate between the better water, which was used for drinking, and the slightly less good quality water, which was used, for instance, for the bathing establishments. So, I mean, but an ordinary city, a city like Pompeii, I mean, had an aqueduct. I mean, pretty much, I mean, any city that needed an aqueduct got an aqueduct. And that's bringing in fresh, clean drinking water. Nothing comparable really in Europe until, I don't know, 12th, 13th century, when cities like, Siena and Florence and Perugia start to build aqueducts and built their great sort of civic fountains to celebrate it. Alongside that, they build drains, and those drains actually sometimes are still functioning. I mean, a city like Pavia, I mean, they're carrying off stormwater rather than sewage, but extraordinary achievements. And again, nothing remotely comparable for centuries. One of the problems about Rome, of course, is that it all pretty much disappears at the end. So it's not as though, the legacy has it's an achievement at the time, and then it's an achievement that more or less disappears. But certainly, and then of course there's also the bathing establishments. Admittedly not accessible by people like slaves and the very poor, but huge swathes of the population have access to public baths.
Was there a maintenance requirement to maintaining the aqueducts, maybe why they disappeared after the Roman era, or was there, how did it cost, was there a cost to maintain the aqueducts?
Certainly. I mean, it requires constant maintenance. And obviously, what you do to clean out an aqueduct is you send a few slaves down. It's not all wonderful, but yes, no. I mean, maintaining the Roman aqueducts was a substantial investment, and for the most part, that disappears in the immediate post-Roman period. Drains survive better because they're not so vulnerable.
Now, the next topic, of course, on Reg's list is medicine. So let's talk a little bit about, and of course, medicine isn't exclusive Roman intervention or invention. It's, of course, come from the Greek world as well. So let's talk a little bit about how medicine advanced in the Roman world.
Now, this is something I know absolutely nothing about, and I'm not sure I would have put it on my list, because I don't think the Romans do particularly achieve that. I mean, I think sanitation, which of course is part of maintaining people's health, is far more significant in the Roman world. And the Romans didn't really have things like hospitals, and I don't think doctors did very much that was very different from the Greek world.
It was quite dangerous to go to a surgeon. It was almost life-threatening, wasn't it? Especially if you required surgery. I mean, didn't they have the famous head surgery? And I think we see this in the HBO series on Rome as well. How dangerous head surgery actually could, and going to the doctor actually could be in Roman times.
The answer is I don't know, but yes, I mean, surgery was very dangerous right away up till the 19th century, and I mean, but I don't think actually but it's not an area I have any expertise in. But I wouldn't have put it into the life of Bryan given a choice.
Something next, I think we talked about this before. It's of course a famous Pax Romana. So public order is obviously one thing that I think you can contribute to the Romans. So let's talk a little bit about how public order actually worked in the ancient Roman world.
Well, obviously, the absolute key thing is keeping enemies out, and there were enemies beyond the frontier, not just along the Rhine and Danube, but also there were, wild people in the the Berbers in Africa and other people sort of inland from Africa. I mean, keeping
the
them out.
Persians in the east.
Yes, the Persians, of course, are slightly different because they're another advanced state. So there, it's a question of big armies rather than raiding groups. But I mean, the main achievement is keeping. Oh, and obviously in Britain there are people like the Picts in the north, and then there are the Irish from across the sea. So actually, kind of protecting the population is absolutely key. Internal order. I don't know that it's necessarily absolutely brilliantly wonderful, and it was probably pretty brutal. But there were local levies of kind of police force type institutions. I don't think it was brilliant. I mean, I think the main achievement is, as it were, just peace in terms of keeping enemies out. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, I mean, absolutely key. The Mediterranean is a entirely peaceful sea, which is not the case. Well, not until the very modern period does that become the case again.
So, of course, I made an episode about this a while ago, but the Romans' roads goes without saying. So let's talk a little bit about how the roads became such a big, huge part of the Roman world, and of course, as we discussed in that episode, they seemed quite safe to travel on. Even you would think that there would be bandits everywhere robbing you, but they actually seem to be quite safe to travel on.
I think that's true. I mean, because they're maintained by the state. I mean, the state builds the roads basically for its own purposes, in order to move messengers around, in order to move armies around. They're not building roads. They're not building infrastructure in order to develop the economy. And equally, they build, ports and harbours for the same sorts of reasons for the states. But crucially, then they get used much more widely. It's not, they don't build a road because they think, oh gosh, we need to build a road between, I don't know, Ravenna and Milan because, there's so many people need the road. They build the road because the state wants to build the road, mainly to move armies and to move its own administrators along. But it then has the benefit that it's there. And one of the striking things about Roman roads are one of the things that actually persist into the post-Roman period because they're very solid. The cuttings are there. Many of the bridges actually survive. So, I mean, they have a persistence much more so than aqueducts, for example. And the same's true of, ports. They build new ports because they want them, but then they're very useful. It's a huge difference from before and certainly after as well.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about education as well. What was education highlighted, or how did Rome bring education into the Roman Empire?
I don't think, again, a bit like medicine, I don't think there's a huge difference from the earlier sort of Hellenistic and Greek worlds. I mean, the people who were educated were the people who were highly educated were aristocratic males only. On the other hand, I don't think many people would dispute that basic literacy became much more important under the Romans than it had before, and was certainly more important than it was immediately afterwards because of the complexity of administration and the economy, which required writing and required lots of people to be able to write. And we do get an indication that actually basic literacy spreads quite deeply in things like graffiti. Pompeii is the classic case.
Romans go home.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Though it was misspelled, isn't it, in the Life of Bryan? Yes, yeah, that's right. So I don't think, there's an educational revolution, but there probably is something of a revolution in terms of use of basic writing for functional purposes. And in fact, I mean, much of Roman education for the aristocrats, is sort of kind of useless. It's learning how to recite Virgil and deliver a good speech and to know your way through Homer. But so it's partly education in order to single out elite people as being able to do things that other people can't do, rather like I don't know, in the 19th century, elites knew Latin. It wasn't any use, but it just marked them out as elite. And we're probably doing the same. We just don't quite know what it is that we're doing that's useless.
I'm going to say that it kind of brought history. I mean, obviously the Greeks as well were kind of started history and writing history, but I would say the Roman as well that kind of took this history to the next level with all the amazing historians such as Josephus or Diocletian, not Diocletian, but Dio, Cassius Dio, or Pliny, or all these historians. I think history is as well one thing that we can kind of contribute to Rome to as well. That like I said, the Greeks already done this, but I think the Romans helped advance the history field as well.
Probably, yes. Although, of course, quite a lot of it is deeply kind of hagiographical of, imperial achievement. I mean, they're certainly not humble, the Romans. I mean, the self-criticism, criticism of emperors, criticism of, of politics, but certainly self-criticism is not a great feature of Roman life. Indeed, arrogance is unquestionably a feature.
So the next thing, of course, is language, and Latin is arguably one of the most influential. I would say that we have from the Roman Empire. It would be the lingua franca of the medieval world, all the way up until almost the 15th, 16th, 17th century. So let's talk a little bit about how the Latin language, and of course we have Spanish, modern Italian, or Greek, and even Romanian as the tongue because of Latin. So let's talk a little bit about how the Latin language helped influence the Mediterranean world and beyond.
Yes, no, you're right. I mean, it's absolutely crucial in terms of creating a lingua franca, which then, in fact, that's something that definitely, does survive the Roman Empire. Aqueducts may go, but Latin doesn't. And of course, Latin is actually brought into by people who'd never had, I mean, in post-Roman period, by people who'd had no contact with Latin, people like the Norwegians or the Swedes, who would be all perfectly happy to learn Latin in the 13th, 14th century as a way of reading what was current at the time and a way of communicating. And indeed, it persists into the 17th century. I think people like Newton are writing in Latin as late as the late 17th century.
And to mention regarding your comment, we even have a historical work called Historia Noria, which is a history of Norway. I don't remember when it was written, but it's as you may already have guessed, it was written in Latin as well. I think it was 12. I don't remember which century this was written in. But it's goes to show how influential Latin has been. Like you said, it's even influenced Scandinavian countries as well when Christianity came.
Absolutely, and of course, I mean, it's left its legacy because, I mean, as you mentioned, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the Italians, the Romanians. I mean, they're all speaking late Latin. I mean, it may have, changed. Obviously, it has changed over the centuries, and it's divided up a bit. Oh, sorry, Catalan, of course, as well. There are probably other. Basically, huge swathes of Europe are still speaking Latin, late Latin. In fact, actually, interestingly, with the decline of Latin as the common language in the sort of 16th, 17th century, I think actually it creates a bit of a problem in Europe. I mean, obviously, now increasingly English is a common language, but there's quite a long period when there really isn't a common language. French to some extent, but I think it actually, if anything, became a little bit problematic in the 18th, 19th century.
Let's talk about a little bit of gladiatorial games and the games that we got from Rome as well, because that's I mean, with the reason maybe which I heard is quite bad with Gladiator, of course, being one of the most famous gladiatorial movies. So let's talk a little bit about how the games worked in ancient Rome and how this would also influence, because we have the Hippodrome games and we have several games, not just gladiatorial games, but the famous term bread and circus, of course, arrives from ancient Rome.
Yes, I mean, this, of course, is something which, well, certainly gladiators are very much out of fashion today, and I don't think, and rightly so. And of course, I mean,
Aww.
this. Sorry?
Aww.
Okay. But I mean, and here, as it were, the Romans are seen as bloody, whereas the Greeks were all into Olympic games and nice things. It's difficult. I mean, it was thought to be important to. I mean, these games are paid for by aristocrats and by emperors in order to entertain the people, particularly when, if you became a consul, you were expected to hold consular games. And either in the hippodrome or circus, which are chariot racing, or gladiatorial or wild beast shows. I don't know terribly much about it. And I don't know, it's an interesting question. Why do they do this? Why is it thought to be so important? When, later it isn't the case that in the 18th century it was considered crucial for people to put on spectacles. Yeah,
But again, the very term bread and circus is still used today, and it's like I said, it did come from ancient Rome, as far as I know.
Yeah,
So
no, it does. It does.
One of that's arguably one of the most famous terms, I think, to come out of Rome as well.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yes, I mean, because obviously the Roman budget, what they're doing is they're sustaining some cities like Rome with things like bread and circuses, and local aristocrats are providing a limited amount of the same sort of thing in their own cities. But there's no sort of welfare system, and there's no there is a very, very, very limited public education system for elites. So although the Roman state is highly sophisticated, it's minimal in terms of its intervention powers in comparison to a modern state, where obviously we're paying huge amounts in health and crucially, basically health and education. I mean, neither of those things are state supported in the Roman period.
Another thing, of course, is I would say this arguably is contributed to Rome is Christianity, because Christianity, I think, is, and again, this goes back to, we see this as a joke in Life of Brian, but I think it's fair to say that Christianity came from the Roman world.
Well, unquestionably, it spreads and achieves its universality thanks to Rome. That's unquestionable, because it's people moving around within the Roman Empire who bring Christianity to the other provinces, and absolutely crucial to the survival of Christianity into the post-Roman period is the fact that the Emperor Constantine, at the beginning of the 4th century, becomes a Christian. His children are Christian, and apart from the Emperor Julian, all emperors are Christian. So it becomes fashionable and advantageous to be Christian. And key fact is that very large numbers of people in the West have become Christian before the barbarian invasions. And the barbarians, of course, are all pagans, so that actually Christianity survives. I mean, it's a sort of truism, but I mean, it is true that the Roman Empire, in a way, survives in the form of a religion, Christianity, using Latin the language of the Roman Empire. So it survives as a sort of cultural unit, despite the total disintegration of it as a political unit. So yes, no, I mean Christianity we don't tend to think of Christianity as a product of the empire because of the persecutions, but then Constantine adopts it. It's already been spread because of the empire, because of people moving around. So, for instance, in Rome, in the sort of 2nd, 3rd century, a lot of the Christians are, Greek immigrants. So, yes, definitely Christianity is a product of Rome.
One last thing I want to talk about before we start talking more about the negative things we got from Rome is, can concrete be contributed to Rome, or is it more a Greek thing?
No. Concrete is definitely Roman. My dad wrote a book on Roman architecture, which is still in print, and concrete is the great key innovative thing. Things like the Pantheon, a massive concrete dome. Again, it's something happens. It leaves these huge, wonderful relics, but actually then disappears after the Roman Empire. So it's not the case, there's a continuous history of concrete from Roman times to, Nervi in the 1960s in Italy and into the present. It's something that has to be sort of reinvented much, much later.
Now it's time to start talking about we talked somewhat about this, but it's time to talk more about the negative sides. And one of those things, of course, that we got from Rome, and again, is not entirely Rome's fault, so to speak, but the Greeks had this as well, is slavery, because slavery is, of course, part of what Rome was built on, and but I think we also should add that the Roman slavery was not at all what we see in the transatlantic slavery. It was quite different, but slavery it's not a positive thing at all. Of course, it's slavery is, of course, on the dark side of the Roman world.
Yes, although of course slavery was common to all societies. There's plenty of slaves in Persia. There were plenty of slaves in Greece. So it's not unique to Rome. It's certainly the case that successful enterprises abroad bringing in slaves happened on quite a large scale, and it's certainly the case that at least briefly there was agricultural slavery, which actually is not totally uncomparable to North American, cotton slavery. Probably quite limited.
The minings, the slaves in the gold mine,
yes. Oh, yeah. Sorry, yeah, no, mining, absolutely, and poor, unfortunate criminals, including Christians sent to the mines, and you're sent to the mines, and you are not expected to survive. No. It's a, it's a brutal world, and people at the very bottom of society have a really rough time. But that's probably true in all societies. It is possible to reconstruct early Germanic society as lots of free peasants, maybe having a slightly less materially comfortable time, but being very free and being much more sort of egalitarian. And it is possible. It's very hard to prove. And certainly, in the early Middle Ages, people had slaves, and they capture people and they sell them. There's the famous Anglo-Saxon slaves who are at the end of the 6th century have been sold probably by Frankish people who've raided southern Britain, and they've been sold and they're appearing in the slave markets of Rome at the end of the 6th century, where Pope Gregory meets them, and he has that famous joke, known Angli said Angeli, not Angles but angels, because he likes their fair hair, and then he then sort of says that. So I don't know that, slavery certainly isn't unique to Rome, and we just don't really have the figures to know whether proportionately to the population there are hugely more slaves or not. I don't know that we can tell.
But if you were a horse slave, you did have quite intelligent some slaves as well. Some were even more intelligent than the masters because they used slaves to, especially horse slaves, to use to do their taxes, to do the paperwork, etc., and do all these kind of things that you didn't want to do yourself. So you had quite you could even I'm again I want to emphasize that this while but it's still not a good thing, but you could advance quite far if you were a slave, if you were a host slave. Sorry, that is because you
Yes,
had
no. Very few slaves do, and then in fact they become freemen. So there was, but on the other hand, a lot of house slaves are used for involuntary sex. So I mean, there are downsides definitely to slavery. I think the problem about slavery is really knowing whether the Roman world was worse than other. I mean, I think all societies, including our own, are pretty bloody awful in terms of lack of.
definitely, yeah.
And I think all pre-modern societies were pretty bloody awful in ways that even we recognise are pretty bloody awful.
I want to talk a little bit about the bad side of being a soldier as well, because it's not like we have today, where it's mostly 1 year service in the army and you're done. But in the Roman world, of course, it was, and we made an episode of this with Adrian Goldsworth many years ago now.
Okay.
But yeah, if you had 25 years of service as a Roman soldier, and that could take a toll if you were a farmer. It could ruin the farm as well if you were gone in, say, fighting in Spain or in the Rhinelands or wherever. It could ruin the if you came back, it could actually ruin the family, your personal living. So it wasn't always, even if it's kind of glorified in a sense today, being a Roman soldier, how they fought these awesome epic battles, but it could also take a toll on the family, and it could be quite ruinous for certain. If you weren't elite, it could be quite disastrous as well.
Oh yes, no, I mean unquestionably, and I mean I know most about the late Roman Empire, but it's actually quite striking in the late Roman Empire. I mean, 3rd, 4th, 5th century. Increasingly, the soldiers come from either actually they're recruited from the barbarian world, or they're from the marginal provinces like the Balkans. So I mean, they're coming out of they're coming out of poverty, and they're joining the army through poverty. But that's, as it were, true of armies in almost all periods. I'm told, I don't know the statistics, that the vast majority of the British army in the 19th century were actually Irish, and they're Irish because the Irish were very poor. So, as it were, the army was one way out of extreme poverty. And it's still true. I mean, it's generally the socially marginalised who join the army. I mean, even today, it's not a sort of a choice that most people want to take. But obviously, you got fed, you got paid, you might die. Yes, no, I mean, I don't. I mean, I'm very glad I don't live in the Roman world. I mean, I'm very, very glad I don't.
You briefly mentioned it, but it was, and I think we talked about this before on the podcast, but if you were poor, of course, it was not a fun time necessarily to live in the Roman world. So let's talk a little bit about poverty. And was there any chance if you were poor that you could be lucky and grow rich and become part of the elite? What was it like to be poor in the Roman world?
I don't. Well, we know very little about it because the poor don't write, and people just took them for granted. I think it was bad, and it was just being poor. I don't think it was,
I mean, if I may, we know a little bit because we have these house scenes where I think Mary Bird made a documentary about this as well, where she thought about how people were cramped in these poor houses and housing facilities where there were just 6 to 12. I don't know the number, but I think it was something like 6 to 12 people living in the same house, like in a small flat in the poor part of the town of Rome. So we do know somewhat about how cramping
Yeah.
could be living in Rome if you weren't rich or if you didn't live in a Palatine hill, for example.
But I mean, but that's true right the way through the Middle Ages into the early modern period. I mean, medieval cities are absolutely. I mean,
Or
people just.
today, if you will, in third world
Yeah.
countries, or
Yes.
even
Yeah. Yeah.
some
Yeah.
places in the United States or UK today, is still true.
Yes. I mean, in comparison, people have a hell of a lot more space in places like Britain, even if they're poor. But no, I mean, unquestionably, into the early modern period. I mean, medieval cities were just jam packed with people. I mean, unbelievable numbers of people crammed into houses. I don't think it's significantly different to other periods, but I mean, again, it's hard to prove.
So I want to touch a little bit, and of course we talked about this in the last episode as well, when the decline or fall of the Roman Empire episode. But I want to touch a little bit about how the fall of the Roman Empire was not as a, and again we should probably say that people didn't really think that Rome fell like snap of the finger. It wasn't like, oh, Rome is gone, we're Italians now. It wasn't like it fell in a it didn't fall in. It wasn't built in a day, and what didn't fall. It didn't fall in a day either, so to speak. But let's talk about the negative impact that the fall of Rome had. I mean, again, we spoke a little bit about this about Britain, how it was kind of turbulent in Britain for decades after Rome. So let's talk a little bit about the negative impact that Rome had after its decline and when it finally fell.
Sure. I mean, interestingly, I mean, I wrote a book about this in 2005, and actually, I think one of the things that I argue there, which I think is true, is that ironically, the fact that the Roman economy was very sophisticated meant that when the Roman economy collapsed, people were actually worse off than they were, before in the sort of late Iron Age. Because in the late Iron Age, you had lots of local industries which were able to produce things and distribute them quite widely, but not enormously widely. But then in the Roman period, you get giant industries that produce pots and sell them over huge distances and probably kill off local production. It's a sort of early form of globalization with the dependence on the global producer. When that goes at the end of the Roman Empire, things are worse than they were in the immediately pre-Roman Iron Age. Certainly in terms of things like pottery production, possibly food production. It's impossible to tell, but I mean, the Roman Empire, when it goes in the West, and I don't think this can be questioned, there is not just a political disintegration, there's an economic disintegration, and almost certainly a substantial drop in population. That's impossible to prove, but unquestionably a huge drop in terms of sophistication of production.
The last thing I want to talk a little bit about, and we talked about this in the very beginning, of course, a little bit, is war crime. They weren't afraid of committing war crimes or genocide, for to use a modern term, like Carthage, for example, or they were quite brutal in taking down rebellions, as we see with the Boudica
Sure.
in Britain. So they weren't really afraid of committing war crimes. I mean, of course, that wasn't a thing back then. War crimes wasn't really a thing until the first Second World War, but or maybe but it's the Romans weren't afraid of doing terrible atrocities against their enemies as well.
Oh no, absolutely not. But again, that was just normal. I mean, that, and arguably it still is normal. Before we sign off, though, I'd like to say one other couple of things that, in a sense, I think are a bit worrying about Rome in terms of legacy.
Yeah.
Because, one of the things one legacy, which we touched on at the beginning, is successful imperialism. And as you rightly said, Rome is the model for successful imperialism and therefore sets a terrible precedent for other people to follow. The other thing is actually, which is very worrying in the modern world, is successful autocracy. The Romans moved from a republic, which admittedly was just an oligarchy, to a very, very autocratic form of government. And not only that, but actually the autocracy is, particularly under Christianity, is combined with religion. So the idea that you have a God-given autocrat, fortunately, we haven't quite got there yet in our new trend towards autocracy, but it's a very, very, very dangerous precedent and a terrible legacy. We say aqueducts, concrete, great, fantastic legacy, and I think they are. But there's a legacy from Rome in terms of the ideal of empire and the ideal of God-given autocratic rule that is worrying.
I think it's fair, and I say, and this is especially true of the colonial empires. I think, in my view, don't think really anything good. We talked about some of this today, ironically, but I don't think anything real good has come from empire, because mostly it's about oppression and power and extracting resources from the occupied colonies or territories. So in empire in the long run, it's not about, like the British or French said, civilizing the colonial territories that they had, but it was more about having power and extracting resources. And because as you well, I'm sure they mostly looked at the conquered people were looked at second class or third class citizens. So it's mostly,
yes,
I would say that nothing real good, and this is especially true of later empires, nothing real good comes from empire.
Yes, although arguably, a little bit like the Romans, the fact that the imperial state wants to build railways, arguably, by chance.
But again, as we see in India, if I may counter argue, we see that the railways are mostly for white citizens and are mostly the first.
Oh yes, no.
Yeah.
No, I'm not denying that, but on the other hand, they're there after. They're still.
That's fair. That's fair. Yeah.
It's an unintended knock-on effect. But also there is this very substantial difference between the Roman Empire and most modern empires, which is racism.
Yeah.
The Romans weren't really very racist.
They kind of were, but not in the modern sense.
Well, they were very aware of their own superiority, but it wasn't impossible for people to become Roman.
Yeah.
It was a lot easier than it was, for instance, for somebody of a different coloured skin in Africa to become British. So, in fact, I think Roman sort of racial and class structure is much more permeable than, say, 19th century colonialism.
I want to end on a little bit, trying to do a little dark road, but I wanted to end on a little high note and ask you, overall, what are your thoughts on Life of Brian? Of course, it's more a silly film, but from what we discussed today, and of course, this episode was made because of the movie, but what are your thoughts? Do they bring up some good points once in a while, or is, because they kind of make a little bit fun about it, and we discussed this earlier as well, when in an earlier episode, about 100 episodes ago, where especially in Jerusalem, in the time of Christ, there were kind of several messiahs. There were all these messiahs coming around, and Jesus was just kind of lucky to get this become then recognized messiah in a way. But so they try to poke a little bit of fun about that complex as well. But overall, do they get some kind of point out in the movie, or how do you feel about it? Not just from a historical perspective, but overall, what are your final
Oh,
thoughts on
sorry,
it?
it's one of my favourite films. I think it's I mean, it's a work of genius. I mean, the bit that's slightly faded with time is the conflict between, I can't remember whether it's the Palestine Liberation Front, as opposed to
Yeah.
this Liberation Front for that I think has faded a bit because people aren't quite used to that kind of stuff. But I think well, it's I mean it's very very bold, of course, also on religion.
It was
But
actually banned in Norway, because of
where was
the
it?
top. Yeah, and
Okay.
in Sweden they would have commercials where they said "So good is banned in Norway."
That's great. But I mean, but my I mean, my favourite scene is the very end. I think is it Eric Idle on the cross singing
Yeah,
always
yeah, yeah,
always look on the bright side of life.
yeah.
No, it's an absolutely wonderful film. I think I think it's the best Monty Python by quite
I
a long
actually
shot.
know most people prefer and I plan to discuss this one as well. Of course, I think they prefer what's the other one called? The medieval one. I
Oh
don't
yes, yeah,
I don't
no,
remember what it's called on top of my head, but I actually prefer the Holy Grail. Sorry, the Holy Grail. That's the name.
yeah.
I actually a number of other people prefer the Holy Grail over Life of Brian, but I actually prefer the Life of Brian over the.
Oh,
I
the
think it's
life of,
funnier
but
than Life of Brian or the Holy Grail.
it's also much bolder. Oh yes, I know my favourite scene, which is the Sermon on the Mount, when
Yeah,
they're somewhere away and they can't quite hear,
yeah,
and they say, "Did he say, 'Blessed are the
yeah.
cheesemakers'?" And they say, "Yes, but I think he probably included all makers of
Oh, big
dairy products."
nose.
Yes.
And I think the
Yeah.
stoning is quite fun as well.
No, it's
When they
fantastic.
go to the stoning,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Oh yeah, that's
they
wonderful.
are all
Yeah.
women, and they turn just
Yeah.
fake bird. The
Yeah.
Hagrid scene is quite good as well.
Yeah. No, no, it's great. It's a great film.
Yeah,
Love it.
so I think we're gonna round it up there. But before we go, of course, it's been a great pleasure to have you back on, and you're always welcome back to the podcast. Do you have anything you want to promote? Anything you want to share social media? If people have further questions about
Mm,
what we got from the Romans, or do you have anything you want to promote? Links in the description before you go that you want to share with the audience.
No, I don't think so. I'm very happy. It's very nice to speak to you, and very nice to speak to anybody who happens to be listening to this at any point. And thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
Me too.
Thanks.
Me too. This has been Well That Aged Well. We are available on social media on the Twitter/X under Well That Aged Well. We are also on Blue Sky under Well That Aged Well. Instagram Well That Aged Well as well. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars if you like this episode, or you can give us one. It's a free world, at least for now, by the time of this recording. We are, of course, on Apple Podcasts as well, so if you could give us a 5-star review and write a review, that would be fantastic. If you're on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. Check out some other episodes that we made. We always have some good stuff going on, and upcoming episodes that you're gonna love. We also check out our episode on the decline and fall of ancient Rome, of course, that we did earlier last year. That this has been the That H2L. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.